Wooden shader is applied to multiple objects around the scene in difference to the concrete material we've worked on, but since we've planned some things ahead while modeling, you may remember we've created this main wooden material already and applied it to all of the objects that would be made from wood. So what we have to do right now is simply selecting them and hiding everything else. So I'm doing that by pressing the Shift H keys. And yeah, these are the objects we have to work on right now. We can always double check if they bear the same shader by playing with the viewport display color. So I'm doing it right now, as you can see, just to double check. And a benefit of that solution is once we set up this shader for one of the elements, it will look exactly the same on each one of them. We have visible right here, but we still need to UV map each of the elements independently. So let's start doing it right now, and we can go with the stairs. These are pretty easy. I will start by selecting one of these steps and separating it from the stairs. Now I will enter the edit mode again and separate the bottom face from the rest of the object by creating the UV seam. So you can see it looks like that. Switching to face mode, pressing H to hide, and now I'm simply selecting these 4 edges here and making another seam layout. I will now unhide everything by pressing Alt H, select everything, and press U, unwrap. So this is how our stair, just one step, looks like. So we can already preview it by importing the texture. I'm gonna use chocofur wood 24 diffuse map, which comes from one of the models. So let's plug it in here and switch to the look dev view here. You can see the texture already displays on the model in a very generic way, but let's ignore that and simply focus on our model. You can also see in the viewport layout, in the UV layout, sorry, we have those 2 islands maps rotated. So let's make them horizontal, but it doesn't look good in the viewport, as you can see. So let's now rotate them all together. And this gives us pretty nice looking mapping on the object. We can scale it down a little bit, and let's remember to keep the islands within the layout here, because it's not always the case that we are using a seamless texture. Sometimes you can see the connections like here are visible. It's also not always possible to keep the UV layout within the square, but if it's possible, then let's just keep it like this. So I'm not now gonna move the origin to the geometry of that object, just to edit it easier. And I will simply press Shift D in the edit mode, move it here. Now Shift R multiple times. Let's now focus a 3D cursor around our first step, cursor to selected, select everything, change the pivot point to 3D cursor, scale Z to align those elements this axis, and now X, S, X to move them around in this axis like that. So you can see we have this UV mapped element recreated. The problem is, if we switch to the look dev view again, you can see we have exactly same texture look on every step. In order to fix that, we simply need to enter the edit mode, and in the UV layout here, go to the UV and pack islands option. So you can now see every single step looks different, and that's because it now shares a different part of the layout. If we scale it up, the texture will become a bit smaller around this every single step, so we might consider doing that. But again, just please keep in mind those border areas are a bit, well, risky if you want to avoid texture seam being visible. Just please keep that in mind when you're scaling the elements like this. But yeah, I would say the steps, they already look pretty nice. Let's now move to the handrail. This element is also relatively quick and easy to do. So let's enter the edit mode, switch to the wireframe and to the edge selection. And I'm gonna select these edges here, mark them as seams, and these edges here as well. So what it does, it actually separates those two huge side faces one from another. As you can see, when I'm hovering my cursor and pressing L key, they are selected separately. So let's select everything, press U and unwrap. This is the UV layout we have now available. Let's now align the elements. So I'm gonna hover my mouse button and hit L key on the keyboard, move those side elements to the side, and now I'm gonna select those side faces and rotate them so we have more or less this vertical view. We can go back to the viewport, switch to the look depth view and see if the element actually matches what we have here in the reference. Let's switch to something like that. You can see the tiling, the repetition of a texture is a bit denser than what we have here. Let's see if we can achieve a similar effect. So first I will quickly rotate the other part. Let's select it, switch to this view here, and just rotate it with Control key pressed, just to limit the rotation a little bit. We can just do it without a very precise measurement. So I would say this is enough for those two parts. Let's now scale them up, just like that. So the repetition of this wooden pattern becomes a bit more denser. If we scale the objects within the Z and Y axis here in the UV layout, you can also see how it affects the texture. So I think scaling those elements within the Z axis just a little bit improves the look, in my opinion. Let's just keep it like this. So that would be it for the handrail. Let's now move to those panels around the staircase. If you look at these panels closely, they are basically the same shapes as the staircase steps, which we have already UV mapped. So the procedure will be the same. The only difference is we could delete those upper faces because they will be covered by the ceiling anyway. So let's do it right now. And now by pointing my mouse cursor and hitting the L key on the keyboard, I will just separate those horizontal panels first and UV map them. So let's switch to the wireframe, let's switch to the edge selection, and by pressing the B key I will start selecting the corners. So you might think there's nothing happening, but if I zoom into those areas, you can see we have all those edges selected. And if I switch to the orthographic view, it's more visible this way. So let's keep working around those corners. And once we are done, let's now press Ctrl E and select Mark Seam. So we have asked Blender to cut those meshes around the corners. If I select everything and go with U, unwrap, you can see we have each one of those panels UV mapped and cut around the corner like that. Let's now switch to the Look Dev view again and check the alignment of the panels. So you can see some of them are rotated this way and some like this. We need to switch back to our perspective camera and check how it should look like. So in the reference we can see these panels are correct and these two, at least these two, need to be fixed. So again, I'm just pointing my mouse cursor over them, pressing the L key. Now I will select everything within the UV editor, press R, 90, enter, and it's fixed. Let's now double check the entire element. Yeah, it seems like these two panels need to be adjusted as well. So exactly the same procedure. And yeah, exactly the same steps. So we'll apply to the remaining panels we have here and to the panels around this element as well. So to save you time watching the exact same procedures, I will just do those elements myself and get back to you once they are done. So the elements are now finished and we can quickly check their look. But before we end this video and move to setting up the actual materials, I still want to talk a few small issues I had when UV mapping those elements. One of the problems you might have come across was uneven scale of the UV mapped elements. So for instance, if I select this face here and scale it up and select these three faces here and scale them down hugely like that, you can see right now we have few elements looking like this and one element looking like that, which clearly stands out from the rest of the object. And we could obviously hand pick those faces and fix them within the UV layout, but what if we would like to have a general uniform scale around all of the elements? To do that, we simply select everything within the UV layout, go to the UV and select average island scale. So what Blender does for us is setting up a uniform in the middle kind of scale for all of the elements. So now you are assured that they all look the same, that the pattern of the texture has the same scale on each face, on each part of the geometry. Another problem is this element here, which doesn't have a perfectly rectangular shape. It actually has this little corner here, and if you try to unwrap it, UV map it, by default this will be the shape you have. So in order to fix that, we simply go with U, unwrap, and try a different method of unwrapping. So let's go with conformal, and that should fix the problem for you. The problem is in general generated by this little corner here, because if we select the entire element and zoom in, you can see we have those two overlapping faces. So we could simply add a seam around this area and unwrap it again. So Blender moves this element to the side. And yeah, if simply switching the method doesn't work for you, then try to work on the seams of the element a little bit more. Last problem I had were the drawers here, and if we compare them with the reference, you can see the wooden pattern has to go throughout two of those elements, or throughout every single pair of these elements. And if we simply unwrap this mesh in Blender, the UV islands are kind of placed randomly around the layout. So in order to have exactly the same effect as in the reference here, we need to hand pick those faces and align them together here in the layout, so it looks simply, well, as it should. It's not that hard, it's simply like a handmade process. So you need to grab every single face and move it around so they all match together. So these were the main issues around UV mapping of those wooden elements. We now have it all covered, and we can finally move to setting up the actual shader. To start working on the wooden shader, we need to find a surface which is big and straight, and that would be the handrail in our case. So I'm gonna hide everything except of that model, and let's now start working on the shader. We already have a texture applied here, so let's maybe try checking its color. If we compare our texture to the reference, we can see the shade of wood is a little bit more red, I think. So in order to adjust that, we simply add color, hue, saturation node, and change the hue just below 0.5. So let's try let's try 0.48. I think that looks quite nice. Maybe it's a little bit too red. This is, yeah, let's find something in between like this. And the second step when I set up the color is playing around with saturation. So let's decrease it first. But I don't think that's the effect we are looking for. So let's get back to the default value and maybe increase it slightly. Yeah, I think it looks better. Maybe it's a bit too much. So let's keep the saturation at 1.1. Let's now work on the reflections. So we need to disconnect the texture we just prepared and set the base color to something darker. Similar steps as we had with the concrete shader. I'm going to reduce the roughness just to see some of the environment. And now I'm going to add converter, separate RGB node here, so we can split our texture into 3 color channels and use them as inputs to our wooden material. So let's go with the red channel and plug it in as a roughness. I think it looks pretty good actually out of the box. Let's check the other channels. Yeah, the green is too reflective, and blue has no reflections at all. So let's keep the red, and to fine tune it again, I'm gonna add the converter, color ramp, plug it in here. Let's maybe make a little bit more space, and let's move the handles. With the wooden material, I want to decrease the contrast within the wooden pattern. We don't need that much contrast as with the concrete shader. I think it looks more natural if we, let's see how it goes when we do this very harsh. Yeah, I don't think it looks realistic. So let's avoid those boundary values like 1 and 0. So let's keep the white color to 0.75. And this darker color to 0.45 looks good. Now by moving the handles we can fine-tune the look of our material. I think we have still a little bit too much contrast, so let's maybe work with those handles just a little bit more. Yeah, I think it's fine. Let's just keep it like this for now and we'll get back to it. So now we need to set up the bump. So again, similar as with the concrete shader, we go with the vector and bump node. Let's connect the normal input and output and plug one of the color channels. Maybe let's go with the blue as height. I still need to disconnect the roughness. And yeah, as a reflection it was pretty blank, but as a bump we see a little bit too much detail, so we need to decrease the distance to 0.01. And I think it's still just a bit too much. Let's maybe decrease the strength 2.5 like this. Yeah, I think it's okay. Let's start combining what we have just created. So I'm gonna plug in the roughness setup and the diffuse color. So it looks pretty good. Let's maybe increase the specular to 0.75. And I think what we could fix is if we zoom into the material, you can see those darker areas are more reflective than the bright ones. I think with wooden materials, it has to be inverted. So we would need more reflections in those white areas and less in the dark ones. To do that, we need to invert the roughness input. And you could do it similar as with contrast of the diffuse map by using the gamma node. We could use an invert node here, but to be honest with you, I don't really like using it that much, because what it does right now, it completely flattens the reflections we had. We would simply like to invert the effect we had here, but with the invert node, it actually changes the values of the color. So the way I'm using to invert my reflection setup, I already have here and here. I'm using the color RGB curves. Okay, Blender, I don't know why did you do that. So let's fix it for you. So I'm using RGB curves, and once I plug them in, nothing really changes. So we need to invert this input and this input like that. And what we have right now is more or less the same effect as if we use the invert node, but we can play around with the curve. So you can see if I drop it down a little bit, we actually have the effect we were looking for. So the dark areas are less reflective and the bright ones become more reflective. If we move this handle even lower, you can see the shader looks totally different. So it's a little bit too much, but yeah, that's why I like using the RGB curves, because it's way more flexible and I can quite quickly fine-tune the look of my shader. And so I would actually say that's pretty much it, what we have to do around here. Let's unhide all of the other elements, switch back to our camera view, and let's maybe see how the shader looks around our kitchen. Yeah, I think if we look from an angle here and here and focus on those big wooden surfaces, I think the reflections and everything else looks pretty nice. Again, we can simply select the shader, and as for the reflections right now, you can just use this one point within the RGB curve to fine-tune the sharpness, the contrast, and the general feel of the material. I think it's a pretty good shortcut when setting up things around the scene. So I would say that's it for the wooden shader. We have a concrete and wood already set up. Let's now move to playing just a little bit around the ceiling and the wall here.
Thank you guys for watching. This video is part of my interior visualization course in Blender, which you can watch for free on YouTube. All the necessary details and link to the full playlist can be found in the video description. If you want to support what I do and access all of the 3D files used in this course, plus Blender ready interior setups and over 2000 Blender exclusive 3D models, just visit the chocofur store and learn more about our subscription plans. Again, thanks for watching and I see you soon.